You know, Tom, I've always felt that you were kind of a caricature of a human being, but it's kind of odd seeing it come true literally.
The Constitution occupies a weird place in American life. We all are taught to revere it. On national holidays, people salute it, and yet it's almost non-existent in our conversations about what government should do, shouldn't do, what's good, what's bad. There it is in the background, but that's where most people want to leave it.
Now, you'd think having a constitution in writing would mean it'd be really easy for everyone to agree what it says. Just read the parchment.
Well, as a matter of fact, the entire American Revolution really revolved around constitutionality. And the trouble there was the British Constitution was unwritten. The British Constitution was a collection of documents. It was customary practice, the way things had always been done. And the colonists' view was that if the British government starts reaching for powers that it's never exercised before, then it's breaking with the way things have always been done, and so it's violating the British Constitution.
When Parliament was saying we're doing things traditionally, they also meant, well, we're going to keep changing what that tradition means. So it's like this. Let's suppose I bring you over my house for a traditional Thanksgiving dinner. Sure, we got a turkey, but it's made out of tofu. And then for the side, we got mashed potatoes. They're not cooked, but boy did I mash them. And a nice delicious bowl of cranberries, unsweetened, because we know sugar's bad for you. So this is why the early Americans were so against this use of tradition. They wanted to know what they were getting when it comes to the government.
And that's why it was so important for Americans to write the Constitution down, because they felt like the British Constitution, figuring out what that meant, was like nailing jelly to a wall. I've often thought that there have been times it would be helpful when I'm playing poker to play a living, breathing poker game, so that I've got a pair of deuces, somebody else has a full house, and I say, well, look, sorry, these rules are living and breathing. You're living in the past, man. Pair of deuces wins automatically. Nobody would ever want to play again. You can't run a society like this. It was Justice William Brennan who really popularized this term, the living Constitution, and the implication of it was that if you don't want the Constitution to just change with the times, then you're some ignorant idiot living in the past.
And there have been many, many times the Constitution has changed with the times via the amendment process. The overwhelming number of them have been highly bipartisan because you need 2/3 of the Senate votes and you need 3/4 of the states. And anyone can rattle off what those changes are. Voting age, term limits to the president, popular election of senators, allowing women to vote. So yeah, when times change, the process has been in place. And not only to have the amended Constitution, they've unamended it after Prohibition when they saw that that didn't work. And of course, you can very easily see who would look to the Constitution as a living document, because it's people who didn't like what it had to do in the past. Now, they want to change it, but they don't want to do all the work that went into changing it.
The thinking behind the living, breathing Constitution is that the amendment process is too slow and clunky. We got a big agenda of things we want to do here. So it would be better to just say, well, look, yeah, we know the Constitution doesn't authorize this, so let's let the judges kind of decide how we apply the Constitution to our modern life.
If a large part of the Constitution is meant to limit the powers of government, to have those government officials rewrite what those limits are and say, oh, handcuffs? Yeah, let's just make those out of spaghetti. Oh, you want to lock me in the cell? Yeah, let's make it out of candy and I'll eat my way out, Hansel and Gretel style. It's very convenient for them if they're the ones who get to rewrite what the limits are on their own power.
As a matter of fact, a living, breathing Constitution is really a dead Constitution. Because if it can change at the whim of the government, then what kind of a bulwark is it going to be in defense of your liberties? It can't defend your liberties if it can constantly be changing. So it's not living, it's dead. All right, Michael, let's bring this down to earth. Let's look at a specific example of how the so-called living, breathing Constitution works, and that's what they've done to the General Welfare Clause. General welfare is referred to twice in the Constitution, in the preamble and then in Article 1, speaking about the federal government providing for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Think about it. Is there any dictator who ever lived who couldn't have said that what he was doing was for the general welfare? This is no kind of limitation on power. if that were what the General Welfare Clause meant. But it didn't mean that. James Madison was very clear about this. He said, the fact is, the Constitution lists the powers the federal government has. If it could also then do whatever it thought was good for the country, it wouldn't have bothered making a specific list. The General Welfare Clause means that when you are engaged in the powers we've given you, make sure you exercise those powers with an eye to the general welfare, what's good for the whole country.
Here's a good way for people to look at the General Welfare Clause. Let's suppose I say, Tom, can you do me a favor? And you go, of course, Michael. You're a great guy who I admire and aspire to be like one day. I'll be glad to help you in any way I can. All right. So, Tom, I got this fridge, and I need you to help me bring it up to my apartment. Well, okay, that's not a problem. We all need to keep our food cool as you, Michael. And I say, okay. I also need you to do those dishes because they've been in that sink for quite a while. Got to make some phone calls on my behalf. I'm a very busy man. And I need you to walk my dog, and I also need you to get a dog for me to walk. The idea that the General Welfare Clause means anything you want it to be is like saying, well, let me ask you for a favor, but then that favor ends up being something a little more complicated than just a favor.
Now, how did the General Welfare Clause come to have this enormous, expansive meaning? We can trace it back to a justice from the 1830s, Joseph Story, who said that the federal government can tax for the general welfare, that taxation is one of the powers, and then once it has the money, it can apply that money to whatever it, more or less what it thinks conduces to the general welfare. And eventually, the Supreme Court in Helvering versus Davis, 1937, tried to codify that into law. So, in other words, saying that the General Welfare Clause can more or less be a giant blanket covering every conceivable area of American life.
The Republicans at one point had a constitutional caucus, and the point of this constitutional caucus was they're going to explain the constitutional backing for every bill that was being put forward in the House. So, Tom, you watched Scooby-Doo when you were a kid, right?
Who didn't?
Okay, I'm sure you related very much to Velma.
I guess I didn't watch it.
Well, Velma was the smart one, and she was always the one solving a mystery. And a lot of the times...
Yeah, I guess that's the one I identified with, yes.
So, this constitutional caucus sat down, just like the Scooby-Doo cast, and they said, all right, let's figure out who's behind this bill that we're going to pass. And they take off the mask, and the answer is, the General Welfare Clause. It's always the General Welfare Clause that justifies their bills. In fact, it's not a mystery at all. This clause has been behind pretty much every bill whenever the federal government tries to do something that the constitutionalists never even thought they would have the power to do or even to think to ask for.
It has been putty in the hands of people who want there to be no limits on government power at all, so I say take the putty away from them.
This isn't just something to discuss in some kind of ivory tower way. The General Welfare Clause is an example of how the so-called living, breathing Constitution affects all of our lives.
Well, Michael, if there's one thing today people don't like about the Constitution, it's the Electoral College. Why, we should abolish the Electoral College. Why shouldn't the person who gets the most votes be elected president? What, do we hate democracy?
Well, the person who gets the most votes is the one who gets elected president, but it's just not the popular votes. It's the votes of the electors, and the Founding Fathers did this very consciously and very intentionally.
And these days, the way it works is we have a vote, and in each state, whoever wins the popular vote simply wins all the electoral votes of that state. Think about the Electoral College like the World Series. It's the Mets versus the Red Sox, and let's say the Mets win the first 3 games, 10-0, 10-0, 10-0. And the Red Sox win the last 4 games, 1-0, 1-0, 1-0, 1-0. So who won the series? The Red Sox. They won 4 games. But nobody would be taken seriously coming along later and saying, but let's add up the absolute number of runs they scored across the series. Why, New York scored 30 and Boston scored only 4, so New York is the real winner. We'd think this person was a lunatic because that has nothing whatsoever to do with the World Series or baseball or anything. America is a collection of societies. It's not a big blob. In the Constitution, the United States is consistently referred to in the plural because that's what we are, a group of societies. So the question is, how many of those societies, or how many games, in effect, can you win?
And think about it this way. Suppose you have a restaurant, and you have soup, and you have steak, and you have key lime pie. I do like my key lime pie. And if you separate those out, it's a delicious 3-course meal. But if you put them in a bowl and mix it together, that's not going to improve the experience for anyone. And that's what people are trying to do when they attack the Electoral College. A person in Rhode Island matters as much as a person in California. And they want to put it all together in a big blender is their argument. People are trying to act like this is them being magnanimous. No, 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 no. You can see who benefits from this because it's people in California, people in New York, and maybe 1 or 2 other states. And it's like, great. Between them, they have enough electoral votes to run the whole countries. And the other 47 or 48 states can lump it or leave it because New York and California are going to dictate for the entire nation. It's like a cultural thing. You can't tell someone who lives on a farm, hey, you need to take the subway to go to the store to pick up feed for your horse. Their lifestyle is entirely different, and the federal government has to represent all these different lifestyles, which would be lost if it was just a matter of the popular vote and each state didn't matter one from another. In the same way, I'm not getting a horse to go down the coffee shop over in Williamsburg. It's not going to happen. And I'm not going hunting because there's no deer to be had in Central Park. The Electoral College part of it was designed so that people in big cities can't just look at people in sparsely populated areas and say, you know what? You don't matter. There's more of us than there are of you. So it's not just that we're going to have more of a voice. We're going to be the only ones with a voice.
All right, so let's see. We've somehow managed to cover the Electoral College, the General Welfare Clause, and the living, breathing Constitution, and thereby created the anti-schoolhouse rock. This is the opposite of what I learned in my civics textbook, and probably the opposite of what people are learning all over the country at this very moment.
Tom, let's be honest. If the Constitution were living and breathing and walking down the street, the first thing we would do is to shoot it.
Well, how do you think that went?
I think it went well, Tom. Why are you so stressed about this?
I'm not stressed out. It's just, I'm the one holding up the whole thing, and it's a lot on my shoulders here.
You're a modern-day Atlas, Tom. A 4 foot 11 inch Atlas.